modern philosophy divides between the classical empiricists and the classical rationalists. The rationalists believe that there is such a thing as synthetic a priori knowledge. That is to say that we can know things about the world independently of experience, just through reflection. The empiricists deny that this is possible. They say all knowledge comes from experience. There's no other possible source. The entire movement gets started by Descartes and his new way of ideas, but then after Descartes, people branch off into the empiricist faction and the rationalist faction. Malebranche, Spinoza, and Leibniz are the three key figures in the rationalist part of that tradition, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume of the empiricist tradition that stems from the new way of ideas. Well, today we're going to be talking about the philosophy of Leibniz primarily, and so before getting into the details, I want to remind you of the general divide between the rationalists and the empiricists. The rationalists do think that there is some other source of knowledge. Not all knowledge comes from experience, some of it comes from rational reflection. So it is actually possible to know something about the world independently of experience. The empiricist finds that puzzling. All knowledge of the world comes from experience. How do I know that this classroom, for example, has seats in it? I look at it, I experience it. There's no way to know that just in the abstract. It's something that I need experience for. Now, nobody denies that we need experience for a lot of knowledge. The question is whether there's anything else. And the empiricist says, no, all knowledge comes from experience, at least all knowledge of the world that isn't just verbal knowledge. Whereas the rationalist says, no, some knowledge that really is knowledge of the world is independent of experience. It is inborn, it's innate, it's something that we can recover just through reflection. So the rationalist position is that there are certain things that are just built into the structure of the mind, that are part of our inherent nature as human beings, or to put it in a different context, are part of our evolutionary heritage. These are things that are cognitive abilities that are just built into us. We have them either from the moment of birth, or at least they develop naturally. We are simply the kinds of beings with those kinds of cognitive abilities. And the empiricist says, no, it's all coming from experience. So, as we've seen, there can be concept and judgment versions of this. The judgment version says that all knowledge comes from experience, if you're an empiricist, or if you're a rationalist, no, some knowledge is something that we can derive from some other source. But we can also talk about the concepts that are involved in these things we might know. And so we can say, if we're a concept empiricist, that all ideas, all concepts are coming from experience. There are no innate ideas, as Locke puts it. If we're concept rationalists, we will think there is innate knowledge. If we're judgment rationalists, we will think that there is innate knowledge. And if we think that that innate knowledge, of course, has to be comprised of concepts that we have innately, we will also be a concept rationalist and think that there are innate ideas. So, these are both spheres of disagreement. The concept rationalist says there are innate concepts. And Leibniz gives a number of examples. He's arguing for this position, and here are some instances that he thinks are innate. Can it be denied that there's much that's innate in our mind, since we are, so to speak, innate to ourselves? And since in ourselves there are being, unity, substance, duration, change, activity, perception, pleasure, and 1,000 other objects of our intellectual ideas. So he says all of these are things that are really built into us from the beginning. We are born with, or at least experience at most triggers these things. They are really part of the structure of the mind from the start. So for example, being, the idea of existence. Do we find out that something exists through experience? The empiricist says yes. I'm sitting around there and thinking, hey, you know what? Things around me exist. Hey, I exist. And so infers from experience in the outside world, experience of him or herself, that actually things exist. But Leibniz says, wait a minute, what would it be like to be in a world where nothing existed? I can't even imagine it. Actually, the idea of existence is something that's just built into the mind. The same thing with unity. We take the world and we carve it up into objects. And we think of the world as consisting of objects, objects that have properties that stand in relations, that are substances in Aristotle's sense. They exist in times and places. They do things, they have things done to them, and so on. Well, where are we getting that idea? The empiricist says, from experience. We look at the world around us and we notice there are objects. But the rationalist says, no, it's built into the structure of the mind that there are things, that there are properties, that there are relations between things, and we ourselves organize the world in these kinds of terms. Now, the empiricist says, well, what if experience were very different from this? What if instead of seeing a world where things seem to be divided, we were just like looking at a screen where there were random patterns, maybe color swirls and so on? Is that a world where we get the idea of an object of any kind of unity? And the empiricist says maybe not. The rationalist says in such a world, I think we would take some of those swirls and treat them as objects. We would maybe treat the colors as objects. Who knows exactly what we would do, since that's a very foreign sort of world. There wouldn't be objects in the sense in which we encounter them now, but still our minds would take whatever was there and structure it into things that had properties, things that stood in relations and so on, even if those things were weird color swirls or color patterns or things of that sort. Well, the same thing with the idea of change, or the ideas of causation. In fact, I've been part of some experiments at the Children's Research Lab here, and one of the experiments was really designed to get this question about causation. Is causation something that we learn from experience, or is it something that's innate? And so what they do is they take babies, and they show them things about duration, about change, about causation intuitively, and they want to see how the babies react. So you have a blank screen there, and then you see an object come, and it goes behind the screen, and it comes out the other side. Sometimes it's a choo-choo train that goes down, disappears behind the screen, and then it comes out as a choo-choo train on the other side. Sometimes it turns into a duck. Sometimes other very strange things happen. And basically, they show these to the little babies to see how they react. Now, a 3-month-old sees the train come down and reemerges a train come down and reemerges a duck. Doesn't really notice any difference. Just kind of like, yeah, you know, life is just one thing after another. Can never tell what's going to happen. Things disappear. And that's why babies at a certain stage are fascinated by the game hide and seek, right? You go, boo! And at a certain age, kids think that's the most wonderful thing in the world. Well, why? Do you find it that amusing? I mean, if I go like this, like that, do you say, oh, that's so funny? No, I mean, because why? Well, you expect me to still be there, right? You think, oh, Bonnebeck disappears. He reappears. It's a big deal. But to a child at a certain level, it's like, what a surprise. He goes away. He comes back. I mean, who would have thought it, right? But later, the child starts realizing, yeah, objects endure. They persist over time. And so they've got this idea of duration and some idea of causal stability and so forth. And so the child sees the train disappear and the train reappear. No big deal if the train turns into a duck. And all of a sudden the child, wait, what? And so you can tell when this happens. But now that itself doesn't decide the question. The empiricist will say, see, I told you so. Around 6 to 8 months, the child gets this concept of the duration of objects, gets a concept of causation, gets the concept of persistence, and so is learning it from experience. And so at first glance, it looks like these experiments confirm the empiricist. But the rationalist can always say, no, look, there's a structure in the mind, a structure of recognizing objects, of recognizing endurance, of recognizing causation, and actually it is just being triggered by experiences. It's just that, you know, at a certain stage, the child can't do other things, and then later gets old enough. For example, the 3-month-old can't walk, but later the child learns to walk. Is it through experience? Maybe it's just that it takes that long for these cognitive abilities that are built in from the start to develop. And so the rationalist says, no, we're simply seeing the development of a certain kind of cognitive skill, not it's being learned from experience. So the debate continues. But in any case, that gives you an idea of the nature of the debate, and the Leibnizian position that these things are built in from the beginning, and then really develop over time as the child gets older, is still something that a lot of people in psychology hold. Well, he continues. As these objects are immediate objects of our understanding and are always present, though they can't always be consciously perceived because of our distractions and wants, why should it be surprising that we say these ideas, along with all that depends on them, are innate in us? So one thing he says is, look, we always have these ideas. You can find people who don't have the concept of a cell phone, for example. They've recently discovered a tribe in the Amazon region that was previously unknown. Okay, this tribe has been living there for eons and has really had no contact with the outside world at all. Those people have no concept of an automobile, no concept of a cell phone, no concept of a camera, and lots of other concepts that we take for granted. But do you think they have the concept of pleasure, of pain, of objects, of duration, of change, of causation, and so forth? His answer would be, of course, all human beings have these concepts, which is an indication, he thinks, that those things are really built into us. They are really universal. They're part of our cognitive heritage as human beings. Of course, an empiricist might say, no, it's just that they encounter the world too, and so do we. And so we actually have all sorts of experiences in common. Well, we've talked about the fact that certain kinds of judgments are, in this debate, basically off the table. There are things that are described as analytic, that are true or false purely by virtue of the meanings of the terms. And the fight between the rationalists and the empiricists doesn't concern those. So everybody concedes there's a certain kind of thing we could know, independently of experience. But the empiricist is quick to say it's not really something about the world. So I can know that all bachelors are unmarried. I can know that a soul is a soul. And that has nothing to do with knowledge of the world, it's just knowledge of how to use certain terms. And so the fight isn't about those. The fight is about actual knowledge of the world, things that aren't just true by logic or true by definition. So they have to do with things that are synthetic, where in general the truth value is not determined by the meanings of the terms. It's something that we can understand what it means. It could be true or it could be false. It's something that you might say the truth value is left open by an understanding of the meanings of the terms. We can't decide on the basis of that alone. We need input from something else. Empiricist says yes, from experience. The rationalist says, well, yes, from experience, but maybe also something else. Now, we've also talked, just to remind you, about the distinction between a priori and a posteriori judgments. It's something that comes at first from Avicenna. An a posteriori judgment depends on experience. The only way to get it is by way of experience. But an a priori judgment is something that we can reach independently of experience. Now, in fact, we could learn it through experience. That's not interesting. The point is, we don't have to have experience to learn it. It's something that could be learned otherwise. It's something that is independent of experience and could at least be known by reasoning alone. Hume calls these matters of fact for the a posteriori. They're things we have to uncover by means of experience. And he calls relations of ideas things that can be known by a mere operation of thought. He thinks, by the way, all those are analytic. All those, it's really just a question of analyzing the terms. But that's something that, or analyzing the ideas, to put it slightly differently. Well, let's look at judgment rationalism. The claim that there are synthetic a priori truths. There are things we can know about the world independently of experience. The thought here is just through reason, just through reflection, there are certain things we can know. Now that gives you the image of the philosopher on the mountaintop, sitting there, meditating, and coming to great truths about the world just on the basis of that sort of experience. And indeed, there are rationalists who think that's what it's all about. But you can also think there are things that are much more humdrum, things that really are just built into the structure of the mind, that the baby exhibits either from the very beginning, or at least that develop over time, so that the baby, no matter who he or she is, what culture is involved, what the history is, and so on, nevertheless comes to think of the world as consisting of objects, having properties, standing in relations, knows what pleasure and pain are, understands that things change, understands that things can stay the same, understands that some things cause other things to change, and all of that. Here's how Leibniz puts the issue in a very famous passage. He says there's the question of whether the soul in itself is entirely empty, like a writing tablet on which nothing has yet been written, a tabula rasa, which is the opinion of Aristotle and the author of the essay, which is John Locke, and whether everything that's inscribed upon it comes solely from the senses and experience. By the way, it's often the case that people have Locke's theory described this way. Locke thinks the mind is a tabula rasa, a blank slate, a writing tablet on which nothing has been written. They're taking that description over from Leibniz in this passage. Locke never actually uses those words. He does talk about the mind as a just blank sheet of paper, which is very close. But in any case, or whether the soul originally contains the principles of several notions and doctrines, which are merely roused on certain occasions by external objects, as I hold along with Plato and even with the schoolmen. That is to say, medieval philosophers such as Anselm, whom we'll look at next time. So the thought is, here, look, the soul already contains several notions, several ideas that are innate, but also contains doctrines, also contains things that are bits of knowledge, putting those things together. Like the world consists of objects. Objects change, but objects can also stay the same, even despite changing some of their properties. That some objects cause others to change, and so forth. Hence there arises, he says, another question. whether all truths are dependent on experience, that is, on induction in instances, or whether there are some which have yet another foundation. Now here he's making a claim about the nature of experience. How do I gain knowledge from experience? He says, I use induction. Now what does that mean? He's really saying, I go from particular instances to more general truths. And often I do that kind of thing. I don't notice, let's say, initially any deep law. I am not aware of any deep law. I just notice certain observations. I form certain generalizations. If you want to think of it this way, I develop certain stereotypes. Maybe it's of people, maybe it's of situations, maybe it's of kinds of places. But in short, I come up with generalizations based on experience. Through induction, I move from the particular to the general. So I see objects drop like that, and I start concluding that if you let something go, it falls. And I just encounter that in experience a number of times. And I form the generalization on the basis of my experience that that tends to happen, that it always happens, that it generally happens. I might have a variety of strengths to my generalizations. Now, does everything go like that? Or do things have another foundation, he asks. Well, here's a way of putting then these views in a nice little chart. If we draw a distinction between the analytic and the synthetic, and also a distinction between the a priori and the a posteriori, then we can say, well, the judgment empiricist says there can't be anything that is synthetic a priori. That gets a big red X, indicating there's nothing in that category. Of course, there are things that are analytic and a priori, things that are just true by definition, true by the matter of logic. And then there are things that are synthetic and a posteriori, that we learn about the world through experience of the world. There's nothing really in that analytic a posteriori category. We can know it by virtue of the meanings of the terms. Why do we need experience of the world? All we need to do is know our language. So notice from this point of view, from the empiricist's point of view, a priori and analytic just match up exactly. Something is analytic if and only if it's a priori. And the same thing is true of the a posteriori and the synthetic. Something is synthetic if and only if it's a posteriori. Those categories match exactly. There is no interesting divide between them, so it doesn't matter in a sense whether we start asking about something semantic. Is this determined by the meanings of the terms? Or whether we start with epistemology and think, can I know this independently of experience? Those questions end up being the same question. The rationalist differs in thinking that that category of the synthetic and a priori does have some instances. There are things I can know about the world that are independent of experience. I can derive them from some other source. So I can know something about the world, that's the synthetic part, but independently of any experience, that's the a priori part. Now it's still impossible to have something that's a posteriori and analytic, but at least I can say that the other three categories have things in them. And that means this semantic question, could I figure it out just by knowing meanings? And the epistemological questions, do I need experience to figure it out? End up being different questions. They don't always match. Well, there's a third distinction that Leibniz introduces. He says there are two kinds of truths. Those of reasoning, he calls them, and those of fact. But here's how he defines them. Truths of reasoning are necessary, and their opposite is impossible. Truths of fact are contingent, and their opposite is possible. So the terms here make it sound as if he's drawing a distinction between the a posteriori and the a priori. But it's not true, really. The definition has to do with necessity. Is something necessarily true, or is it just contingent? So, what does he mean necessary? He gives us a very flowery and wonderfully productive way of thinking about that. Something is necessary. If it's not just true in this world, it would be true in any possible world. It could not be false. An impossible truth, well, I guess I shouldn't say a truth. Something's impossible if it could never happen, right? It's not just that it doesn't happen in this world, it could not happen. There is no possible world in which it happens. Contingent truths are true, but they could be false. A contingent falsehood is false, but it could be true. So contingent things are true in some possible worlds and false in others. So you might say there are three options here. Something could be true in all worlds, in which case it's necessary. It could be false in all worlds, in which case it's impossible. Or it could be true in some worlds and not in others, and then it counts as contingent. Well, how does that match up with our other ideas? Yes, I had a really nice thing about possible worlds here, and for some reason I couldn't download the Keynote file. So the PDF it won't play, so we just have to look and I'll say, I have an awesome illustrations of possible worlds where Homer Simpson invents a time machine by trying to fix the toaster. And too bad. Anyway, I sadly skip. But yes, we think about this and we should say, well, all right, necessity and being a priori. Not only Leibniz, but all of the philosophers of this period on all sides of the debate assume that the necessary and the a priori match up exactly. In fact, when Kant is talking about the a priori, he sometimes defines it in the terms we've been using and sometimes just defines it as the necessary. And the contingent, that is something that is a posteriori. And it's not that hard to figure out why they think that. Suppose I could know something independently of experience. Then the idea is, it wouldn't matter what the world is like, right? Independently of experience. I just go, no experience, but I can figure it out anyway. Well, that presumably is something I can do no matter what the world's like around me. And so the idea is, if I could figure something out a priori, it must be necessary. On the other hand, you might say, suppose I require experience to figure it out. Well, that must be because it's the kind of thing that could be true in the world, but also could be false in a world. I've got to figure out which kind of world I'm in. And so that's going to be a contingent truth. And of course, that goes only one way. We'd have to give arguments the other way for the exact match. But the thought really was, look, something is going to be something I can figure out independently of the way the world is, just by reasoning about it, just without experience. But it's got to be necessary. And notice I said there, independently of the way the world is, independently of experience. If you run those ideas together, it seems obvious that there's this kind of matchup. But a contemporary philosopher, Saul Kripke, has introduced arguments that that's too quick, that we really shouldn't assume that. By the way, he wrote his first paper when he was a 16-year-old high school student, and there he is pictured at 16. He is a very smart guy. Anyway, by the way, I mean, not many people have heard his name. He's probably the greatest living American philosopher. Almost certain, actually. And yet he's not a household name. In fact, if I said Kripke to you, you probably think of the character on The Big Bang Theory, the other physicist who talks with the lisp. Anyway, I think that character is, to some extent, modeled on Kripke, this guy. But here are his cases. Okay, there is a category of things that are necessary, but also a posteriori. So they are necessary, and yet they do require experience to figure out. And they have to do with the essential properties of things, the real essences, as Locke would put it. So that water is H2O, that gold is the element with atomic number 79. These are things that require experience. I can't just reflect on that. If take the baby and let them develop however you want. If that baby never studies physics and chemistry, the baby will not know that gold has atomic number 79 and can't just figure it out through internal reflection. On the other hand, it's a necessary truth. That's what water is. And so we might say that captures its real essence. And in general, what Locke describes as real essences, you might think, are things that require experience to know. We've got to investigate to find out the real essence of water, or of oxygen, or of gold, or of any other sort of thing like that. But on the other hand, it's something that really is necessary since it's giving us an essential property of the thing. Much more... Anyway, I think that argument has convinced most people. This next argument has convinced somewhat fewer. He also thinks there can be things that are contingent and a priori. So here is an example he gives. Neptune causes perturbations in the orbit of Uranus. This is something that was well, you might say people knew this before they had actually discovered the planet Neptune. Why? Because they said there's something strange about the orbit of Uranus. We can't explain what's going on here. We can't understand why it does the things it does. So they hypothesized that there must be another planet that was causing that. And before they ever observed Neptune, they said, let's introduce Neptune as the name of that planet, the mysterious cause of these wobbles. And so this was something that was known about Neptune before anybody had observed Neptune. Now, why might you not find that convincing? Well, that's something that isn't exactly a priori, right? I mean, it was based on a lot of knowledge of physics, based on a lot of knowledge of orbits, on this hypothesis there must be some planet. We can sometimes introduce a name in advance of something, and that will be a candidate for this. On the other hand, a lot of people have said, there's too much a posteriori knowledge entering in for me to be fully convinced by that. In any event, if you are convinced by these arguments, you'll think that actually all those categories between the necessary, contingent, a priori, and a posteriori actually have instances. That if they don't match up exactly, in fact, that they're completely independent, and that every category there actually has some things in it. The most controversial one is that contingent a priori one. And so some people have said, no, it's more like this. They're not convinced there could really be a contingent a priori, but they are convinced there could be a necessary a posteriori. And so those things don't quite match up. Well, why have I gone into this? Really just to make the point that once we introduce this third distinction between the necessary and the contingent into all of this, it gets a little bit more complicated. So here would be one way of thinking about judgment rationalism, the way we've been talking about. We're worried about the distinction between the analytic and the synthetic, and the a priori and the a posteriori, and we say there can be synthetic a priori truths. But also, you might say, if we change this a little bit and think about the necessary and contingent instead, and the way in which it interacts with the analytic-synthetic distinction, then we've got the same sort of thing happening where there can be things that are synthetic and necessary. Maybe there can even be things that are analytic and contingent, like that statement about Neptune. Introduced as a definition of Neptune, by the way, and so seeming to be a priori, seeming to be analytic, and yet being contingent. Oh, and another clip. I will skip this. Well, here's the problem now. If we really think there are these things we can know about the world independently of experience, what are they? What are some examples of this? Give me some cases of knowledge. Here are some examples that rationalists have actually put forward. So Avicenna, for example, the whole is greater than its parts, or things equal to the same thing are equal to one another. Here are some examples in Descartes. I think, I am. Also, anyone who thinks must exist. Why do you think? Nothing is made from nothing. It's impossible for anything to be and not be at the same time. Finally, what's been done can't be undone. Now, before we go on, I want to think about one or two of these and just ask you whether you think this is something that is a synthetic a priori truth. Suppose you're an empiricist. You've got two ways of responding to these examples. You can either say, I'm sorry, I think that's analytic. I think it's purely a verbal truth. It's true by definition. Or you can look at it and say, actually, I think it depends on experience. So let's take one of these and see if those empiricist responses work. Let's take things that are equal to the same thing or equal to each other. Okay? We'll start there. The empiricist is going to say, no. That isn't something that I just intuit in some other way than experience. But now, can the empiricists say that's true by definition? After all, the empiricist only has two categories, right? And so the things that are supposed to be in that third category of synthetic a priori truths, they have to be forced into one of those other two categories if you're to defend the empiricist position. Yeah?
The empiricist can say it's true by the definition of equals.
Okay, yes. You might say, look, it's just true by the definition of equals. We use the term equality in this way, right? In such a way that everything is equal to itself, that if A is equal to B, B is equal to A, and if A is equal to B and B is equal to C, A is equal to C. And so that's something that you might actually technically, that is precisely that transitivity principle. It's more like if A is equal to B and C is equal to B, then A is equal to C. But in any case, the thought here is that, yeah, that's just the way we use the term equal. This is something true by definition. I would point out, though, that it's like complicated. If you look in the dictionary for a definition of equal, it's weird to get logical principles like that put down as part of the definition. Still, the empiricist, I think, is going to say, typically, yes, that's something that's just true by the way we use the term equality. What about something like what's been done can't be undone? Could we argue that that's something true just by definition? Or that it's true just on the basis of experience? Yeah.
What did you say that if it's done, it's already going to time, so we can't go back and change it. So it places, as soon as it is done, it places it in time. Because we don't have the ability to put it on the time.
Ooh, all right, good. So if we think about what this means, it's saying what I've done I can't undo. Not in the sense that I can't, let's say, drop salt onto the floor and then sweep it up or something, but in the sense that that remains done, right? Events are marked in time. And so what's happened when I drop the salt onto the floor is that something's occurred now. And even if I pick up the salt, I don't change the fact that that happened. That sort of got marked in time, and it's still a mark. I can't erase that past, even if I can try to get rid of some of its effects. So, now does that imply that it's something true by definition of the terms? Does it imply that it's something we learn through experience? Or does it suggest that it's something about the universe that is really something we can understand independently of experience? Because I think you're absolutely right. It has to do with the fact that as time proceeds, things happen in time, and once they've happened, they can't unhappen. We can't wind time backwards. So that idea, you can't go backwards in time in this way. You can't rewind time. Is that something true by definition? Or is that something that's a fact about the world? And if it's a fact about the world, is it something that we learn gradually in experience? Or is it something that, in a sense, experience presupposes? I don't know either. Go ahead.
When we have to see if a child, like a baby, we have a concept of time. Sure, the answer if it's experience or presupposes.
Oh, well, all right, interesting question. Would a child have even the concept of time? Would a child be able to grasp this? Now, if we have the view that if this is innate knowledge, it's something that we would really have from the very beginning of time, then we're going to think, yeah, if we could somehow rig up an experiment in the children's research lab to test this, then maybe we could find out something. On the other hand, it could be that, let's say, the baby at a certain point really doesn't have this understanding, and yet later does, and would be in the same situation as with duration and persistence and change and causation. Namely, something happens there, but is the baby learning from experience, or is it just taking time for this built-in set of conceptual abilities to develop? And so I agree with you that, in a sense, we could try to devise an experiment like that, and yet I'm not sure it would be decisive. The same possibility of interpretation may occur. Yeah?
I'm kind of confused about something. If these are all, are we agreeing that these are all synthetic for now?
No, that's up for debate, yeah.
I was going to ask what's the difference between something that's true by like the way we use language and true with respect to the world.
Okay, good. Are there any up there that you think are true just by virtue of language? We've already talked about the equality one. Maybe that is. Any others that stand out as something you think is true by definition? Yeah.
Nothing is made from nothing.
Nothing is made from nothing. Yeah. Now, is that true just by virtue of the meanings of the terms? You might think it depends what we mean by made from. If you mean like there's this whole thing there, but it's not just that it has no parts. It's really that each part of it is just blank. Then it does feel like, wait, that. On the other hand, so often this is meant that nothing gets caused by nothing. It's like if nothing exists in the universe, it couldn't be that something just springs out of nothing. And then it's less obvious that it's a matter of definition. But still, yeah, so it depends, I think, which of those we have in mind. Notice the whole is greater than its parts is related to that one. And it's a pretty good candidate for being just true by definition. That's what it is to be a part or a whole. Any others you might think are a matter of definition or logic or something like that? Yeah?
I feel like what's done can't be undone. It's true based on definition just by done.
Ooh, all right, good. You might think of what the tenses mean. What does it mean to put something in the past? What's been done? That means there's a time in the past that happened, right? And that means you can't be undo it. Well, that means, look, I guess if you can't go back in time, then there's no way to change that, right? We've got time proceeding here, and so at some point, actually this event occurs, and now we're here, so this is now. Here's the past time where that event occurred, and once it's there, how could there's nothing you can do about it? What that means is there was some time when it happened, and there was some time when it happened. You can't really change that fact. Now, there is not really a well-agreed upon logic of how that goes, of how possibility and necessity interact with times. And so I wish there were. I wish I could say, yes, we logicians understand this now thoroughly and have a theory that supports that claim. But it is plausible to think the way time goes, this just means there was a time when it happened. And so once it's happened, that's just true, and nothing further that can go on can change it. Okay, well, let's take a look at some other examples. Leibniz gives this one, the principle of sufficient reason. There can be no fact without a sufficient reason. Why it should be so and not otherwise. Everything happens for a reason. It's the kind of common sensey version of this principle. So everything happens for a reason. There is nothing that just sort of happens randomly to be so. There's always a reason why it should be that way and not otherwise. And then Kant has these examples. Every event has a cause. Notice if I said every effect has a cause, that would be just true by definition. But every event has a cause, that's different. Arithmetic, 7 plus 5 equals 12 is his example. Or in geometry, between any 2 points lies one and only one line. Those are things that, he says, are not true by definition. On the other hand, they don't require experience. Arithmetic, you can just sort of do that in your head. You don't have to actually go counting physical objects. And medieval philosophers had a variety of others. Maybe God exists, or the soul is immortal. Maybe the world consists of substances and their attributes. Or the will is free, or every substance has an essence. Or you ought to seek the good. Happiness is intrinsically good. Courage is a virtue, and so on. So all of those are things that people have thought at certain points are synthetic a priori truths. They're not things that come from experience. On the other hand, they're not just true by definition. At least some of them, well, can you think of any there where you might want to say, no, that's just true by definition? Yeah. The world consists of substances and their attributes. What, like, that would be part of the definition of what? The world?
All consequences.
Oh.
Simply because it consists of something that wouldn't be a world.
Okay, here's his argument. Look, it wouldn't be a world if it consisted of nothing. So it's got to consist of something. But some things are objects. Okay? So the moment we say there's something in it, well, that thing is going to be an object. So you could try to defend the claim that this is something just true by definition. Well, if we think about all of these, we can see that it can be hard to settle these questions. So how do we know there is such a thing? If we have to fight case by case, it's going to go pretty hard. But here's what Leibniz says. He gives us some general arguments why we have to assume there are synthetic a priori truths. He says some events can be foreseen before we've made any trial. It's manifest that we contribute to them something of our own. The senses, though they're necessary for all our actual acquiring of knowledge, are by no means sufficient to give us the whole of knowledge. The senses never give anything but instances. That is to say, particular or individual truths. So here is his argument. The senses are always giving me particulars. I experience particular objects, particular events. And then I somehow draw conclusions about all objects, all events, or general patterns at any rate of events. So here's a way we might frame the argument. Experience is always of particular instances. But knowledge that's immediately justified by that experience then is going to be knowledge of particular instances. I can know that that thing fell when I released it, for example. But universal truths don't follow from their instances. I mean, you saw me earlier drop the inhaler. If I take this bag and drop it, it falls. I take this piece of chalk and drop it, it falls. I'm not going to do that, I'll smash all the chalk. I'll take the eraser and drop it, it falls. And so all of those are particular. Now, does it follow from that everything I drop will fall? Well, not logically, right? It could be that the next thing I actually release does not fall. And it's not that weird. Imagine that I pull out of something up here a canary. And I say, well, what happens when I drop the canary? And it flies away, it doesn't fall. So it's not impossible. And so that is an indication. That doesn't follow. The fact that I've experienced this in that particular instance doesn't mean everything of that sort will happen. So here's a way of thinking about it. We infer things about the world by going from particular instances to general truths. But the fact that it's been true for A and for B and for C and so on and so on and so forth doesn't prove that it's going to be true for every single object. That argument is not valid. It could turn out that we need a counter instance. For years, people thought that all swans were white, and indeed every observed swan was white. And then, lo and behold, in the middle of Australia, they found a black swan. And so they realized not all swans are white. But they have many, many particular instances of it. It's a swan and it's white, swan and it's white, swan white, swan white, swan white, and suddenly, boom, swan black. And that's something that showed that actually you could not infer that universal truth from all of those particulars, no matter how many there are. But Leibniz points out what that means is that to get anything universal, we would need some other premise. So he says, logic, along with metaphysics and ethics, blah, 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 are full of such truths. Their demonstration can come only from the inner principles that are called innate. So in other words, we need something else, and that thing is an innate argument. Well, here is another argument. He says, all the instances that confirm a general truth, however numerous they may be, are not sufficient to establish the universal necessity of that same truth. For it doesn't at all follow that what happened will happen in the same way. Now, we've already talked about a case of this, but notice here he brings in necessity. And it brings out another dimension to the argument. We can say, look, all that we experience is contingent. We are experiencing contingent matters of fact. Things that, as a matter of logic, could turn out that way or could turn out some other way. But from a bunch of contingent truths, nothing substantive is going to follow about necessity. Necessary truths don't follow, except trivially, in some cases like logic or something, from contingent truths. And so, the knowledge we immediately justify from experience is not only always particular, it's always contingent. Yet somehow we think we can get laws out of this. Laws that describe not only what has happened, but what must happen. But experience alone can't justify a necessary truth. So here's our idea again. We've got all these particular instances, A, B, C, holds for all of those. But now we conclude necessarily all F's are G's, or F's cause G's. That could be a version of this argument. We observe this, then that in all these other cases, so we infer that's always the relationship, that this must cause that. But that, again, doesn't follow as a matter of logic. Leibniz's point is we need something else. So it happens no matter how we think about that argument. So he says in the end, we need necessary truths. We need to assume that some of these necessary truths about the world really are innate, and only then can we actually ever conclude that something is a law, that something has to happen, not just that it has happened or that it will happen. So he says necessary truths are going to have principles whose proof doesn't depend upon instances or upon the witnesses of the senses, and so in those areas too we're going to encounter things that are synthetic a priori truths. Okay, so what are some examples? We've already talked about a number of these cases. Some of them are metaphysical, like substances have properties and stand in relations, events take place in time, and so on. Some of them are ethical, like happiness is good, courage is a virtue, good is to be sought, evil is to be avoided, treat others with respect, act on principle. There are all sorts of ethical commandments that various philosophers have taken to be synthetic a priori. Mathematics. Things like every number has a successor, or there is an infinite set, or the union of two sets is a set, or the power set of a set is a set. Those are things that are very fundamental principles in mathematics, and they aren't obviously true by definition. It looks as if they're actually synthetic claims. Well, finally, and here's the key point, scientific laws. Scientific laws that tell us not just the way things have happened to be, but actually claim that in all cases, things must be that way. Force equals mass times acceleration. That isn't saying, hey, around here we've noticed that force seems to correlate with mass and acceleration. No, instead, it's really something that's just saying, at all times, in all places, under all conditions, this relationship holds true. And the same thing is true for the ideal gas law, for the for the law relating momentum to inertial mass and velocity, to the rule relating rest mass and inertial mass, then to chemical principles like that, sodium hydroxide and hydrochloric acid, and salt and water. Those are things that are meant to be universal laws, describing how things always happen and how they must